There are moments in human history when the world seems to hold its breath, when the fate of nations, faiths, and empires turns upon a single collision of power and will. In the spring of 1241, Europe stood on the edge of such a moment. From the endless steppes of Asia, a shadow had risen, swift, silent, and unstoppable. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan and tempered in blood and fire, was now moving westward. City after city had fallen. Kingdoms had vanished. And now, that tide of destruction was crashing against the heart of Christendom. What unfolded on the fields near the Polish town of Legnica was more than a battle. It was a reckoning, a confrontation between two worlds that could not have been more different. On one side, the armored chivalry of medieval Europe, proud, courageous, bound by faith and honor. On the other, a force of disciplined warriors who fought like no army Europe had ever seen before, the heirs of the steppe, guided by strategy, precision, and an unbreakable chain of command. This is the story of that clash, the day when the thunder of hooves shook the continent, and the illusion of European invincibility was shattered forever. The year was 1241. Across the snow-dusted plains of Eastern Europe, the greatest military machine of the medieval world was advancing. The Mongols, masters of mobility, deception, and terror, had already left a trail of ashes stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Hungary. Entire nations have been erased, their rulers dead or enslaved, their cities smoldering ruins beneath the endless sky. Now, their next target lay ahead, the heartlands of Poland. But to understand what happened at Legnica, one must first understand who these Mongols truly were. They were not the wild savages European chroniclers would later describe in trembling ink. They were the inheritors of a new science of war, a living engine of conquest built on discipline, communication, and adaptability. Every Mongol warrior could ride before he could walk. Each could loose an arrow at full gallop with terrifying accuracy. They could cross thousands of miles with no supply trains, surviving on dried meat and fermented mare's milk, sleeping in the saddle if necessary. To them, endurance was religion. Their empire stretched from Korea to Kiev, and their reach seemed limitless. By the time they reached Europe, the Mongols had already crushed China's mighty Jin dynasty, shattered Persia's Khwarezmian Empire, and burned Baghdad's allies to the ground. Even the Great Wall of China, the ancient symbol of impenetrable defense, had failed to halt their advance. Now, under the command of Bada Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, 3 Tumans, about 30,000 men, swept through the west. They burned Kiev, ravaged Hungary, and turned their eyes toward Poland. But this was no chaotic rampage. It was a calculated maneuver, a campaign designed to clear the Mongols' flank before their main army pushed deeper into Europe. Bada split his forces. One army drove through Hungary under his own banner. Another, led by the generals Baidar and Kadin, rode north through Poland, tearing through every stronghold in their path. Lublin fell first, then Sandomierz, followed by Kalisz and Krakow. Each city was wiped clean, its resistance crushed before it could unite with the next. Their next objective was Silesia, one of Poland's richest and most strategic duchies. There, Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious, stood in their path. Reports from the east had already filled his court with dread, entire towns erased overnight, survivors describing riders who appeared from the horizon like ghosts, vanishing before reinforcements could even arrive. The stories sounded like divine punishment, but Henry was no stranger to war. A devout Christian and seasoned commander, he knew that if the Mongols weren't stopped here, all of Europe could fall. He sent desperate messages to his neighbors, pleading for aid. And across the Holy Roman Empire, his call was answered. The Knights Templar, legendary veterans of the Crusades, rode to his side. The Teutonic Knights, hardened by years of bloodshed in the Baltic campaigns, joined as well. Polish nobles rallied their banners. Duke Mieszko of Opole brought his men. Even miners from Silesia's goldfields, men who had never lifted a weapon in their lives, took up axes to defend their homeland. Chroniclers would later claim that 100,000 Christians assembled under Henry's banner. The truth was smaller, yet still formidable, perhaps 25 to 40,000 men, one of the largest European armies of the age. For comparison, William the Conqueror had taken England with a mere 10,000. Opposing them were two Mongol Tumans, around 20,000 elite warriors led by Baidar and Khatun. Baidar, a grandson of Genghis Khan, and Khatun, the son of the great Khan Ogdi, were not simple soldiers. They were masters of psychological warfare, deception, and maneuver. Years before their invasion, Mongol scouts disguised as merchants had crossed Europe, mapping its roads, fortresses, and armies. They knew the rhythm of European warfare and how to break it. The European knight was the pride of Christendom, a symbol of courage and faith wrapped in steel. Mounted on massive war horses, armored from head to hoof, their charge could break almost any line. But against the Mongols, that strength became a weakness. Heavy armor slowed them down. Their horses tired easily. Their discipline faltered when drawn into pursuit. And while they sought glory in close combat, the Mongols killed from a distance, invisible and untouchable. April 7th, 1241, dawn. The allied army of Europe advanced from Legnica. At the center rode the knights, steel gleaming under the pale spring sun. The Templars' red crosses shone beside the black cross of the Teutonic Order and the white eagle of Poland. Priests walked among the men, offering blessings and hearing last confessions. On the flanks marched infantry, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and Silesian miners armed with hammers. The air was thick with faith and fear. It was a vision of strength, the unity of Christian Europe gathered beneath one purpose: to stop the storm. And then, across the horizon, a line of dust began to rise. It was not the slow, steady march of men. It was faster, fluid, almost alive. The storm had come. The first Mongol riders appeared on the horizon, like ghosts materializing from the morning mist. Their movements were calm, deliberate, and unervingly synchronized, their silhouettes flickering in the pale light. They rode small, muscular steppe horses, animals built for endurance rather than spectacle, and to the European knights watching from afar, the sight drew laughter. These were the conquerors of Asia, these short men on shaggy ponies? The knights smirked beneath their helmets. They believed one thunderous charge would scatter these riders like dust in the wind. But arrogance was the first casualty of that morning. The Mongols approached just far enough to test their weapons. Their bows, intricate composite recurves made from horn, sinew, and layered wood, could send an arrow farther and faster than anything Europe had ever known. When they released the first volley, the sound was like a living storm. Arrows sliced through the air with a rising whine, then fell in lethal arcs across the plain. Shields splintered, men screamed, and horses reared in panic. Before the Europeans could even react, the riders wheeled their mounts and disappeared behind a curtain of dust, only to return moments later to strike again. The rhythm repeated endlessly: advance, unleash, retreat. To the untrained eye, it seemed chaotic. To those who survived, it was terrifying precision. Each Mongol carried dozens of arrows and had several horses trailing with more. The volleys never stopped. The battlefield became a trap of noise and motion, where death came from distances no one could even see. European discipline began to waver. These men had been raised on tales of glory, knights charging in shining armor, banners raised high, clashing swords, and honorable duels. But the Mongols refused to fight that kind of war. There was no honor, no chivalry, only efficiency. Each arrow was a calculation, each movement a lesson in control. Crossbowmen tried to return fire, but their weapons were too slow. Every time they raised their bows, the enemy was already gone. By dusk, the plains were littered with corpses and dying horses. The ground ran dark with blood, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. Duke Henry's forces had endured hours of torment and gained nothing. The Mongols, on the other hand, had lost almost no one. When night came, fires flickered faintly in the distance. The enemy camp looked peaceful, almost serene. Then came the sound, deep, slow, and unending, the beat of Mongol war drums rolling across the plains. It was a sound that carried fear into every tent. The knights lay awake, staring at the dark sky, knowing the enemy was still out there, waiting. April 8th, 1241. The dawn rose blood-red, and even the priests whispered that it was a bad omen. The European camp was silent except for the moans of the wounded. Many had died in the night. Tensions broke into shouting. Polish nobles blamed the Templars for cowardice. The Teutonic Knights demanded to charge. Duke Mieszko threatened to withdraw his men entirely. Duke Henry tried to hold them together, but the army's unity was cracking. When the Mongols appeared again, Henry hesitated. Their arrows struck with the same deadly rhythm, testing the Europeans' resolve. Finally, in a desperate attempt to restore morale, he gave Mieszko permission to attack. 2,000 armored knights thundered forward, sunlight flashing off their steel. Their lances lowered, their battle cries echoing across the plains. The Mongols turned and fled, a familiar sight that stoked European pride. "We have them," Mieszko shouted, "for Christ and Poland." But this was no victory. It was the beginning of the end. The knights chased their enemies for miles, their heavy horses panting beneath the weight of armor. The Mongols remained just out of reach, taunting them, turning back occasionally to fire arrows that found their marks with cruel accuracy. As the pursuit stretched on, discipline broke apart. What had started as an army became scattered bands of riders, each chasing their own mirage of triumph. Then the plains erupted. From the hills, hidden squadrons of Mongol heavy cavalry charged down in silence. From both flanks, light horse archers closed in, encircling the Europeans completely. The trap had been set from the very beginning. The Polish knights, exhausted and disorganized, were trapped in the open. What followed was a massacre. Arrows fell like rain. Sabers finished what the bows had begun. Duke Mieszko fought until he was pierced by 5 arrows. His men died around him, some praying, others screaming, many too tired to lift their swords. Of the 2,000 who had charged so confidently, fewer than 200 made it back. The survivors were hollow-eyed, their armor dented, their spirits broken. They spoke of an enemy that fought like one mind, silent, disciplined, almost supernatural. One dying knight whispered again and again, "They are not men. They are not men." That night, as campfires burned low, a lone rider approached Duke Henry's camp. He came unarmed, carrying a small parcel. Inside was the severed head of Duke Mieszko, preserved in salt. Attached to it was a short message in crude Latin. Tomorrow, April 9th, 1241, the day of annihilation. Dawn came gray and cold over the plains of Legnica. Duke Henry's forces were breaking apart. Whole divisions had vanished overnight. Nobles had deserted with their retinues. The wounded filled the camp, and morale was all but gone. But Henry knew there was no running. The Mongols would chase them down on the open plains. The only choice left was to fight and face their fate head-on. He chose his ground carefully, an open field near Legnica Pole, a place that would be remembered for centuries. A small rise in the center gave his archers some advantage, and a narrow stream guarded one flank. He placed his knights at the center, flanked by infantry and mercenaries from Moravia and Bohemia. Behind them, under his personal banner, he kept a small reserve, the last shield against oblivion. Then the horizon darkened once more. The Mongols appeared like a mirage of shadows and dust, their banners fluttering in the wind. But this time, something was different. They weren't charging or loosing arrows. Instead, they rolled forward strange wooden frames, each carrying a massive iron cauldron. Confusion rippled through the European ranks. Were these weapons? Instruments of ritual? The soldiers watched in silence. Then came the hiss, a sound no one there had ever heard before. A spark, a flash, and the sky erupted in fire and smoke. The Mongols had brought something new to Europe, something terrifying. For the first time, the sound of exploding gunpowder the earliest form of battlefield explosives, echoed across the fields of Legnica. It was not just a battle anymore. It was the dawn of a new kind of war, one the old world would never forget. Thick black smoke rolled out like a tide of darkness, swallowing the open fields in a choking embrace. It wasn't just smoke, it was a weapon, alive and deliberate, creeping low across the grass like some monstrous, sentient fog. The stench of sulfur and burning pitch hit first, a sharp chemical bite that clawed at the lungs. Then came the blindness. In mere seconds, the brilliant morning light vanished, replaced by a suffocating gloom. Soldiers coughed and gagged, tearing off helmets and gasping for air that wasn't there. The carefully ordered European formation, so proud, so precise, disintegrated almost instantly. These were no cannons. Europe would not know the thunder of gunpowder artillery for another century. But this was something far more insidious. Early gunpowder smoke bombs, a grim innovation the Mongols had mastered through their campaigns in northern China. The devices were simple, hollow shells packed with sulfur, saltpeter, and resin, designed to burn slow and thick. But the effect was revolutionary. The battlefield became a nightmare of confusion. Commands were lost in the chaos, horns silenced beneath the chorus of coughing and screams. Banners, the medieval language of command, vanished into the haze. What had begun as a battle soon devolved into a blind, gasping struggle for survival. And then, in that murky confusion, the Mongols unleashed their next weapon, not of fire or steel, but of deception. Days earlier, they had captured several Polish prisoners. Rather than slaughter them, the Mongols had forced them to teach their captors a few vital phrases in Polish. Uciekadzi, straceni jesteśmy, run. All is lost. Now, hidden behind the curtain of smoke, Mongol riders shouted those words with uncanny accuracy. The effect was instantaneous. Polish soldiers, hearing familiar voices in the darkness, believed the retreat had been ordered. Panic spread like wildfire. Men stumbled into each other, trampling comrades underfoot. Knights collided with their own infantry in the confusion. Horses screamed and reared, throwing riders to the ground. Within minutes, the mighty Christian host dissolved into chaos. The left flank was the first to break. The peasant levies, untrained and terrified, threw down their weapons and bolted for the forest. That collapse exposed the heart of the army, where the Templars and Teutonic Knights stood their ground. Encircled and isolated, these warrior monks refused to retreat. They had sworn their vows before God, and they intended to die beneath their banners rather than flee. Surrounded on all sides, the air thick with arrows and smoke, they formed a tight defensive ring, shields locked, blades drawn. Arrows hissed through the gloom. Curved sabers flashed in and out like lightning. The Templars fought in grim silence, every movement precise, mechanical, a ritual of death. When the smoke finally cleared, the ground around them was carpeted with bodies. Their grandmaster, Pon Dobon, was found at the center of the carnage, pierced by 23 arrows, his sword snapped in two. Around him lay dozens of Mongol corpses, a testament to defiance in the face of annihilation. Elsewhere, the Teutonic Knights made a desperate bid for freedom. Forming a wedge, they lowered their lances and charged into the gray mist, crashing through Mongol lines with brute strength and sheer will. For a brief moment, it seemed they might escape, but the Mongols, light and fast, regrouped instantly. They pursued the armored knights across the open plain, surrounding them like wolves circling exhausted prey. The Teutons' heavy armor, once their greatest advantage, became their downfall. Their horses, drenched in sweat and terror, stumbled and fell. One by one, the knights were dragged down, crushed beneath their mounts, and cut to pieces where they lay. From a distant ridge, Duke Henry of Silesia watched his army unravel before his eyes. The banners of Christendom that had once flown proudly were now lost in the smoke. Driven by duty and desperation, he made one final attempt to turn the tide. Raising his banner high, he spurred his horse forward and charged into the inferno. His voice rang out, calling his soldiers to rally. For a fleeting moment, hope flickered. Scattered knights began to form ranks again, gathering around their leader's banner. But fate was waiting. Somewhere within the haze, a Mongol archer drew his bow, calm amid the chaos. The arrow struck Henry beneath his arm, sliding through the weak point in his armor. He wavered but refused to fall. His guards encircled him, fighting desperately to hold off the attackers. But the Mongols had seen the ducal banner, and they closed in. They struck like lightning. Henry's guard were cut down one after another. His horse took a blade to the chest and collapsed, throwing him violently to the ground. The Duke, bleeding and barely conscious, was captured alive. The Mongol commanders, impressed by his valor, offered him an honorable death, a swift execution. But Henry refused. "I will die as I have lived," he said, "as a Christian knight." They beheaded him on the spot. His severed head was raised on a spear and carried before the army as a grim trophy. Later, when his mother came to search the battlefield for his remains, she could identify him only by his left foot. He had been born with 6 toes. By midday, the fields of Legnica had become a slaughterhouse. The Mongols, following their custom, cut off the right ear of every fallen foe to count the dead. Chronicles tell of 9 great sacks filled with those gruesome trophies. Between 10 and 25,000 Europeans lay lifeless. The nobility of Silesia was obliterated. The once powerful military orders, the Templars and the Teutons, were decimated, their strength broken for a generation. In contrast, Mongol losses were astonishingly low, perhaps only a few hundred. The battlefield was buried beneath layers of corpses. Witnesses later claimed that one could walk for hundreds of yards without touching the earth. Carrion birds circled overhead for weeks, their wings blotting out the sun. The stench of death clung to the land for months, and even years later, farmers plowing their fields would unearth human bones. The psychological impact of the defeat was as severe as the physical one. Word of the catastrophe spread across Europe with terrifying speed. In Paris, King Louis IX began fortifying the city walls and reorganizing his army. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to save Europe itself. Even the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, long at odds with the Church, suddenly sought reconciliation. Chroniclers described the Mongols as the scourge of God, beings who fought without mercy, without fear, and seemingly without human weakness. Legnica marked the end of an illusion. The age of the invincible knight, the armored noble who believed valor alone could decide the fate of battles, was over. The Mongols had proven that discipline, speed, and adaptability were far deadlier than chivalric pride. Yet from that devastation, Europe began to evolve. Military tactics changed. Commanders studied the enemy's methods, learning to coordinate units, integrate archers, and experiment with early gunpowder technology. Warfare shifted from personal glory to collective strategy, the dawn of a new kind of army. Then, just months later, history turned on an unlikely hinge. In December 1241, far away in Mongolia, the great Khan Ogedai died suddenly. Some said from drink, others from poison. By law, all Mongol princes were required to return home to elect a new ruler. Bata Khan, despite his triumphs, obeyed the summons. The invasion ended not through European victory or divine intervention, but through the death of a man thousands of miles away. The Mongols would never again push so deeply into Europe. Internal rivalries, logistical challenges, and the sheer size of their empire halted further campaigns. But the memory of Legnica endured. It haunted Europe for centuries as both a wound and a warning, a reminder that arrogance could destroy even the proudest civilization. Today, the battlefield lies quiet. Green fields stretch where bodies once lay. A small stone monument marks the place where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Each April, reenactors gather there, dressed in chainmail and surcoats, carrying the same banners their ancestors once bore. But no reenactment, no matter how detailed, can capture the terror of that day. The suffocating smoke, the the screams, the thunder of hooves, the sudden, brutal end of an age. In those few days of April 1241, the Mongols didn't just crush an army. They destroyed an entire worldview. They shattered the myth of European supremacy and forced a continent to evolve or die. The Battle of Legnica was more than a defeat. It was a reckoning. And from its ashes rose the modern art of war, cold, calculated, and unrelenting. 3 days that didn't just change Europe, they changed the world forever.